What if your garden could feed your family, build soil, look beautiful and support wildlife all at the same time? So today I'm talking about why small-scale food forests are powerful tools for self-sufficiency and how you can create one no matter what space you have. In this video I'll introduce what a food forest is, the benefits it has and how you can scale it to fit into your garden no matter its size. My name is Pippa Chapman and I've been designing and managing food forests for nearly 15 years and I still get so excited about helping people to design a food forest for their own garden or community. Anything from a raised bed border right up to 2 acres or more. So the obvious first question is, what is a food forest? So when we talk about food forests, we're not talking about growing giant trees or even growing under and within forests. What we're talking about is taking inspiration from the natural pattern of a woodland. So looking at all the different layers, right from the tall trees down to the ground cover plants that are covering the forest floor. And we're taking inspiration from that ecosystem and then we're tweaking it so that we can be inspired by that to design in our own gardens. So looking at the sort of efficient use of space, so we have 7 layers within a food forest, right from the canopy trees, the large trees such as an oak or a sweet chestnut. Then we've got the sub-canopy trees, so they might be apple trees or hazel or something like that. And then looking at the shrub layer underneath, so things like our currant bushes, gooseberries and raspberries. And then below that we start to look at the herbaceous layer, so these are things like herbs like mint and lemon balm, or perennial vegetables like Babington leeks or perennial kales. Below that we've got plants which cover the ground, so their job is to suppress weeds and make sure there's no bare soil for anything to germinate, any weed seeds to germinate that we don't want. And then even below that, so we're not even just using all the vertical space above ground, we're talking about below the ground level as well. We have plants which are root crops, so things like Jerusalem artichokes and ochre, things where the part that we eat is below the ground. Then growing up between all the other layers, we have our climbers or our vining plants, and they are the things that will grow up between all the other layers and use the trees and branches for structure to climb up. And so that way we have all these different 7 layers within the forest garden. Although saying that, some people also add other layers. So some people look at aquatic plants as well, and also the mushroom, the mycelial layer as well, all the fungi. So there are, I tend to use 7 layers, but there are other people who add in other layers as well. And a food forest is very much an intentional design. So even though we want to mimic that kind of natural ecosystem of a woodland, it doesn't mean that we're just going to throw in some plants and let them grow like they would in the wild. A food forest is a very intentional way of growing these plants. So careful planning to make sure we maximise using the vertical space, but also allowing enough light to get through to the lower layers so that we can make best use of the under canopy as well to grow our perennial herbs and vegetables and root crops. Just as in nature, where a forest, a natural woodland, there's nobody coming in, bringing in extra fertiliser or adding layers of mulch or manure. We want our forest garden, our food forest, to be self-sustaining, so we add in plants which fix nitrogen or plants that we call dynamic accumulators with deep tap roots that will bring nutrients up from deep below in the subsoil, and then as those leaves die off on the soil surface, it cycles up those nutrients back to the soil surface so that the plants can use them. So in this way we create a food system which is self-sustaining, and we don't have to bring in and import other things to fertilise it. So you may think, oh, I've only got a small space in my garden, I couldn't possibly grow a food forest. A food forest sounds like, you need an acre or so in which to grow it. But actually, when we're talking about food forests, and we're talking about the concept of a multi-layered edible food system, you can fit that into even the smallest of spaces. I've designed food forests as small as 2.5 metres by 1.5 metres, and really it's just about trying to get in as many layers as possible. And I'd also like to emphasise that in order to be a food forest you don't have to have all the 7 layers. So obviously most small gardens are not going to fit in the huge canopy tree layer, so that's fine. So you're already down to 6 layers. And then it might be that you just don't have any structures large enough to be able to take a climber. So something like a honeysuckle could take over a small dwarf apple tree and maybe not kill it, but certainly weaken it. So it might be that you just don't have room for climbers, unless of course you've got a space on a wall where you could put a trellis or something. So I think really the important thing is to think about this as taking inspiration from the 7 layers and the pattern of a woodland, rather than feeling like you have to tick every single box and have every single layer in your garden. So I'm going to talk about 5 benefits of growing a food forest in your garden. The first one being that the food that you grow in your food forest is going to be really nutritious, much more so than the food that you buy in the supermarket, because just by virtue of being picked fresh from your garden and eaten straight away, it means that you're preserving as much of the nutrients as possible and you're really eating that food at the peak of its quality. You can grow a real diversity of crops in your food forest. So we talk a lot when we're talking about sort of a really nutritious and healthy diet. Diversity is really key to that. And so by having a real huge variety and diversity of crops within your food forest, it means that your diet and what you're eating is also going to be very diverse. And in terms of cost saving as well, if you sort of concentrate what you're growing on some of the things that are more expensive to buy, so looking at maybe replacing all of your salads with perennial salads, then you're not having to buy in those small bags of salad where really you don't get very many leaves. Then you can start to save a bit of money there. And also berries, so things like strawberries, raspberries, blackcurrants, they can be quite expensive just by virtue of how difficult they are to transport from farm to supermarket. But if you grow them in your own garden, they're just so easy to grow, and so that can save you a lot of money. And berries are some of the most nutritious things that you can grow and eat as well. The second benefit is that food forests are a really low maintenance and self-sustaining way of growing. So, we all have busy lives. I'm constantly out looking after other people's gardens, so I have very little time to actually look after my own. So having a food forest where my food is growing but for very little input of my time is so much better than an annual vegetable garden, which I do grow some annuals, but they take a lot of work. They're much more high maintenance than a perennial food forest system. So just, if you have a busy life and you think that you don't have enough time to grow your own food, then food forests could actually be the answer to that. So obviously the creation of a food forest can be a bit more intensive at the beginning, all of the planting and mulching, but once that is planted, after a year or two, when the plants have all settled in, it can actually be a really, really low maintenance system. So really all you're doing is going in and harvesting, and you're not having to do very much else. A bit of harvesting, a bit of mulching, but other than that you're not having to like in an annual vegetable garden, you're not having to sow seeds, prick out, pot on, plant out, water, all of that very intensive activity. You don't have any of that really with a food forest. And that's partly because we're growing perennial crops. They're much more robust, so they can cope with a little bit of slug damage here and there, and they'll still just carry on growing and you won't even notice, unlike a new seedling, which, a few bites from a slug and it's finished. So you've got these sort of plants, these perennial plants that have put their roots down into the ground, so they don't really need watering except for in drought conditions. You've got plants which are settled in, which are mature, which are robust, and so they really don't need very much input from us at all. I know when a few years ago, I had a really bad illness that started in spring, and I went from running park run one week to not being able to get out of bed the next, and that lasted for about 3 months. Just at the peak of seed sowing time, when you're trying to get your vegetable garden up and running. And what was really noticeable was when finally I was able to venture back out into the garden, the annual vegetable beds were full of weeds, no vegetables that I could pick and eat, whereas my food forest had just carried on happily without me. There were herbs, there were fruits, there was all sorts that I could harvest straight away, having been completely abandoned for 3 months. So that really sort of proved to me the benefits of a food forest in terms of resilience and just minimum input from me. In a food forest, we want to add in plants for pollinators, and that's not just because we want to share our garden with other creatures. It's also partly to attract in beneficial insects, and that way we can design our food forest so that it helps with natural pest management. So we're not having to go in and use damaging sprays that are, can kill all the beneficial things as well as the pests. We're actually encouraging the beneficial insects into our gardens so that they can help to manage our pest problems naturally. And just as with slug damage, perennial plants are much more robust when it comes to a bit of an attack from aphids. So you might have a massive aphid problem on a shrub, but actually if you just wait until some ladybirds come along and devour all of the aphids, then actually that shrub is quite strong enough to recover and still be absolutely fine. The next benefit is that we can build soil. We're using no dig in a perennial system because the plants are there all the time, so we don't need to be digging things out and planting things back in again. And every time that you dig soil, it uses up the organic matter more quickly, it decomposes more quickly, and so we're actually kind of losing soil in that respect. And wherever we have bare soil, there's risk of soil being eroded and washed away. So in a perennial system, we're covering the ground, covering the soil, but we're also layering on mulch, and we're doing sort of chop and drop, which is where you chop up a plant and you just leave it in situ rather than taking stuff away to put on a compost heap. So all of that is helping to build organic matter in the soil, build that fertility of the soil in situ. By keeping the soil undisturbed, we're also helping things like the bacteria, the beneficial good bacteria in the soil, and the fungi as well to grow. When we dig soil, we destroy all the fungal network, and we can kill off that really nice balance of fungi and bacteria that are meant to be in our soil, that are signs of a healthy soil. And the same with the creatures that live in a soil. Some live in the higher layers, some live in the lower layers, and when we dig and we mix all of those up, we're putting the microbes from right down in the soil to the surface where they're not happy, and we're burying the surface ones right down deep in the soil where they're not happy either. So to keep a really healthy soil, we want to make sure that we don't dig, we don't disturb that soil, and in fact we just add to it on the surface, as happens naturally in a woodland. The leaves fall off the trees and the herbaceous plants die back, and they just die onto the soil surface where the organic matter gets pulled down into the soil by all the soil life, like worms and things like that. And by adding in our fertility plants, such as nitrogen fixing plants and the dynamic accumulators, it means that we have natural fertility. So we're not having to bring in synthetic fertilizers. The whole system, it meets its own needs in terms of fertility as well. Another great benefit, and one of the more important benefits to food forest, is its help for biodiversity. So in terms of providing habitat and food sources for all sorts of insects and other creatures. Permaculture is very much about not just thinking about us and what we want from a food forest, but actually what do all the other creatures that we share that space need as well. So even just the fact that you have a perennial infrastructure, you're not taking away, as in an annual vegetable garden, you're not taking away everything at the end of the year. A lot of that stays there. So the habitat stays for insects. So you have maybe some evergreen shrubs that things can overwinter on. You have seeds around for birds to eat. You have decomposing wood on the ground for all the decomposers to eat. So you are keeping that habitat there all the time. And just by adding in small elements like a small pond or a log pile or a stone pile or a dead hedge, you're providing that habitat for insects and things to complete their whole life cycle. So you're not just having plants for pollinators so that they can eat, but you're maybe having some piles of dead leaves where they can also, their larvae can develop and grow. And the final benefit I'm talking about today is about our personal well-being and nature connection. Having a food forest in your garden means you're constantly out picking things and observing and being in your garden. And that's a really great way on a daily basis to have that connection with nature, to get outside, to have something to venture into the garden. So it's not just a pretty border that you look at, it's a border that you have a real relationship with, where you're going in, you're seeing what there is to harvest, and whilst you're there you can be noticing, you know, all the wildlife, what other things are going on in the garden. You get to see the bees and the hoverflies buzzing around the flower, and you get to be really up close with nature, even, you know, just on your doorstep in your back garden. I think it's just a really great way to get to notice the natural patterns of the seasons. And so, you know, you come out and you see things starting to emerge in spring, and then you can enjoy the bounty of summer and autumn, and then even through the winter, you know, when you're going out and you're maybe picking some bay leaves or something like that, you're still observing how much there is still going on in winter. You know, it's not just a case of, oh, my ornamental border's died down for the year, I don't have to look at it again. You're constantly out seeing, you know, what can you pick, how are things doing, and so you start to really build up this great habit, I suppose, of being out and connecting with nature on a daily basis. Not to mention all of the benefits of eating all of that fresh food right from your garden. So how to get started? If you're feeling daunted, you know, thinking, oh, how can I plant all of these 7 layers and do all of this in my own garden? I haven't got any time, I haven't got any experience. I think the most important thing, and what permaculture teaches us, is start small and slow. So you don't have to think about all 7 layers at once. Maybe just start by concentrating on 1 or 2. Maybe you already have some existing trees and large shrubs in your garden. You don't have to clear everything out. Maybe you just start over time replacing the odd plant here and there with something edible or useful. So you might have something that dies off, so you decide to plant in some lemon balm to have as a herbal tea. Or a shrub might die off and you think, maybe I'll plant in something like a blackcurrant and then I can eat the fruit. So it doesn't have to be a case of starting from scratch, clearing out your garden and creating a food forest. It might be that you can develop your existing garden into a food forest over time. And when you're first starting out, it's hard to know what perennial vegetables you're going to like. I mean, personally, I found there's a lot of things that are just too bitter and I just don't enjoy the taste of. So my advice would be, if you're starting out, just try and grow things that you already know that you like. So maybe you know you like kale, so you plant in some perennial kale. Perhaps you know that you really love using onions in your cooking, so maybe have a look at growing some walking onions or some Babington leeks, things that you're already fairly familiar with cooking and using, so you know that you're going to be able to make the most of those plants. And then as you kind of feel more confident and you feel like you'd like to experiment a bit more, then that's fine. Try some more unusual things like some good King Henry or some Caucasian spinach, which is a climbing perennial spinach. And then so over time you can build up your confidence and build up your skills. And so that's a really nice way to develop a food forest without feeling daunted by starting it all from scratch. So I hope this video has convinced you that a food forest is exactly what you need in your garden, both in terms of providing food for you to eat, but also it can be an absolutely beautiful space as well. There's so many ways to introduce colour and interest into your food forest without it just having to look like a wild bit of woodland. You can use variegated versions, such as there's a variegated kale to give a bit of brightness, or instead of a normal hazel you could use a purple leaved hazel. There's so many ways to make your food forest just as beautiful as a normal garden. I would really love to hear about your goals for your own food forest or permaculture garden. I really love replying to comments and having conversations with gardeners who are excited about what they're going to grow. So please comment below and I will read every single comment and I always reply. So this was an introduction to why I think you should grow a food forest, but follow along for lots of other tips on how to design a food forest, how to combine plants, what is a fruit tree guild,